All right, good. I think it's afternoon now there in Wisconsin, so good afternoon. My name is Kevin Fox. I'm an advanced placement teacher in Southern California, and I like to refer to myself as a recovering We the People teacher. I had the great privilege of coaching a team for 15 years. So I know exactly how your teacher's feeling right now, and I'm absolutely sure your teacher will be very proud of what you do today. So good luck.
Hello, Wisconsin. My name is Tim Murphy. I work at the University of Chicago, overseeing their Master of Liberal Arts program and running some continuing education programs for high school social studies teachers. And I'm very excited to be here.
And good afternoon, Wisconsin. It's nice to see each of you. My name's Steve Lindley. I live in Wyoming. I'm a retired criminal justice administrator, and we're looking forward to hearing from you this afternoon. We wish you well.
All right, please introduce yourselves and your teacher.
Good afternoon, judges. We are the Unit 1 representatives from Wauwatosa East High School. We are representing the Wisconsin wildcard team, and we are coached by Mr. Taylor McDaniel. My name is Abigail Leffel, and I am joined by my colleagues Mira Gajria, Nadia Ewell, Kidron Staples, and Owen Gendrick.
All right, excellent. All right, here is the question for you now. The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? And lastly, to what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times? Whenever you're ready.
In 1968, one of the world's most famous bands, the Beatles, released Revolution in protest of the Vietnam War. While the song quickly gained millions of fans, it never mentioned the basic principles of revolution. These principles include popular sovereignty, natural rights, and limited government, all of which were heavily prioritized by the framers. The release of this song, Revolution, 185 years after the founding, demonstrates that the ideological revolution in America is a never-ending struggle and showed the willingness of Americans to use their rights to protest in their pursuit of liberty.
Of the 27 grievances in the Declaration of Independence, 24 addressed at least one revolutionary principle. This is a direct consequence of the absence of these principles under British monarchy. For example, by imposing taxes that did not showcase the desires of the people, the Townshend Acts violated the colony's right to popular sovereignty. Hannah Griffiths, an American patriot and poet, anonymously published in an article, the Pennsylvania Chronicle, encouraged other women to harness their political autonomy by boycotting tea, paper, glass, and paints in opposition to the Townshend Acts. 15 years later, the Constitution directly protected these principles.
John Rawls asserts in his Veil of Ignorance that to produce an unbiased, ethical government, those creating the government should be oblivious to their class, privileges, disadvantages, and even personalities, in order to prevent the creation of principles that benefit specific demographics at the cost of others. Although this idealist philosophy is realistically unattainable, it is exceedingly important to have a deciding body truly representative of the population when creating or amending the Constitution. The framers, however, failed to reach such standards, shortly after writing in the Declaration of Independence that, quote, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, end quote. The Constitutional Convention hypocritically was attended by only a small demographic of the population. A majority of the framers, such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, came from privileged backgrounds, attending college at a time when very few people did, and by 1776 were prominent and wealthy individuals. The Constitutional Convention lacked the representation of a woman, enslaved people, Native Americans, laborers, and more, who in principle could not consent to any propositions. The framers took advantage of this lack of representation to implement measures that institutionalized their power and privilege. Specifically with enslaved people, the 3/5 Clause, 1808 Clause, and the Fugitive Slave Act intentionally deprived their Lockean natural rights to life, liberty, and property.
The revolutionary principles of natural rights, popular sovereignty, and limited government are criteria for an effective governance. Historically, the absence of such standards led to rebellion. In 2020, the Center for Strategic and International Studies found that common grievances in protest overwhelmingly lean on perceptions of ineffective governance. Their analysis also showed that the number of mass political protests worldwide have increased by an annual average of 11.5% since 2009. Wael Ghonim became a symbol for the Egyptian revolution of 2011 after the creation of his Facebook page, We Are All Khalid said, prompting massive protests. Ghonim later told CNN that, quote, if you want to liberate a society, just give them the internet, end quote. The lack of their revolutionary principles caused Egyptians to fight their oppressors for what they deserved, a fair government.
Quote, you say you want a revolution. Well, we all want to change the world, end quote. This lyric from the Beatles song, Revolution, accurately outlines the ideas for men. For hundreds of years, people have continued the revolution to change, and from the Declaration of Independence to modern day, we can trace it all back to those same principles. This concludes our statement, and we are ready for your questions.
Okay, I guess I'll go first then, if my colleagues are all right with that. So you nicely, and I think quite effectively, found some criticism to be made about our scheme of representation in the early days. Bring us up to 2021. How are we doing as a nation in terms of that sense of representation? Better, worse? What do you think?
While we are doing better, there's still progress to be made. According to the Pew Research Center, in 2018, the 116th US Congress had 96% of the House and 100% of the Senate having college degrees, whereas according to the 2020 census, only 36% of the American population over age 25 have college degrees. So the educated people are still overwhelmingly in the legislature.
As well as in reference to federal government, we've only had one president of color, and this year are getting our first female vice president.
Is it necessary that we have like an absolute sort of ratio of representation in our elected bodies? We have to have, like, if there's 50% women, should we guarantee 50% of our representatives? What do you think about that?
I don't think this would be a good idea. I think, though, that what we should strive for is to try and create as much representation as possible, whether that be getting citizens' voter IDs in places where voter IDs are required, such as in Georgia, or just educating low-income or low-educated people on ways or places that they can vote. And I think that because Article 1, Section 1 sets up the bicameral legislation, this is important because you're ultimately not only electing, your president, but you're also electing members of the House of Representatives and the Senate.
I would argue that it may not need to be enforced, but taking Rousseau's idea of a direct democracy, having people directly consent to their government that fit within the demographic that they are in, would prove to be a more effective form of government, considering that it would have the consent of the people directly proportional to that it is representing.
Kind of circling back to the question you initially asked about 50% women, and this reminds me of a quote by Abigail Adams in a letter written to her husband, John Adams. She says, quote, if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound to any laws in which we have no voice or representation. And I think this emphasizes that the importance of representation, and this was written in a letter 150 years before the 19th Amendment, and why citizens might turn to revolution if they're not represented.
I'll jump in here and maybe take us on a slightly different track. Your prepared remarks mentioned like the Egyptian revolution. If you want people to be liberated or have a revolution, just give them the internet. But what's the other side of that coin? So the consent of the governed, what happens when the people consenting are misled or misinformed? How does that play into this? What are the tensions, and how can we help resolve it?
I feel as if when the people are misinformed on what they are consenting, it leads to a form of government where it is based on lies, and we could develop such grievances as back as we did in the American Revolution.
I think, for example, in the October Revolution, this was very prominent because it happened in the capital of Russia, and ultimately the Communist Party overthrew the monarchy. But I think a problem that we saw was the October Revolution didn't directly turn right into this new communist form of government. There's years after, then there's the big Russian Revolution. And I think that arguably, if you don't have like a strong, I guess, outside countries, or just like a strong backing, that revolutions are ultimately unsuccessful then.
To disagree with my colleague on misinformation, a study by Penn State University concluded that no revolution under 3.5% of the population has failed. And I think when talking about misinformation, if that 3.5% is misinformed, thinking of the Capitol riots in January, it may lead to destruction within a revolution, a destructive revolution.
So maybe to build off Mr. Murphy's question just a bit, or at least it's along the same lines, what are some hindrances, do you think, that exist today to some of these revolutionary principles of popular sovereignty and the principle of consent? Are there hurdles in front of us now to meet those principles?
I think one in particular is ultimately striving to create a limited government. There's a quote by Lord Acton that states that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think that this shows just the difficulty. No person in power is really gonna, I guess, want to hand over more power. But I think in the Constitution, for example, we have Article 6, which states that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And this sort of checks the powers on the executive branch. And we also have Article 3, Section 2, which implies judicial review, which allows the Supreme Court branch to check amendments and laws proposed by the legislative branch.
Just then, thank you for that. And then a slight follow-up to that. Do you think consent is easier to achieve today or more difficult to achieve today, which is kind of along the same lines?
I feel as if the consent today is more of a tacit consent. According to Locke, it was more implied than anything else. So our different interpretations among the world of consent could be easily interpreted. Like I said before, it would ultimately lead to a more harder ending between people.
Thank you.
Let's go back to your original statement, and I like that you articulated the 27 grievances in the Declaration. So let's compare and contrast the Constitution to the Declaration. To what extent was that Constitution more revolutionary, and if so, in what ways? Or was it less revolutionary?
The Constitution did outline a lot of the ideals that the founders represented through the grievances. Grievance 31 addressed judicial independence, which we can find in Article 6, Clause 3, that all federal, state, and legislatures are bound by oath by the Constitution, as well as in Article 3, Section 1, that judges get life terms.
Taking Thomas Paine's idea of
Finish your thought.
taking Thomas Paine's idea of a revolution, and that a monarchy is the farthest thing, is the most despotic thing, I would argue that in separating from a monarchy, the Declaration of Independence was more revolutionary.
Okay, thank you very much.
you.
Very good.
I'm going to insist that I go first and repeat that, because I want to beat everyone else at this point. I'm a huge Beatles fan, first of all. I got into the University of Chicago as an undergraduate. My essay was about not Revolution, but another track from '68 off the White Album. But more importantly, I think that opening was reflective of sort of how you approached all of these questions, which is like, this isn't all just dead old stuff from a couple hundred years ago. I mean, you grounded your answers in that. I mean, that understanding is there, but then you were taking us to the Egyptian Revolution, and some of the other things that were coming up in modern day. So I like that. I'm encouraged to see that, because like there's a reason we're talking about this, and it's not just because it's an interesting thing from the past, but it impacts our lives for today. And I think a definite strength of your presentation is the diversity of evidence leveraged. We heard the grievances in the Declaration. We hear modern Pew Research studies, and then we went back to Abigail Adams. So sort of seeing the whole picture here, I think is I think you guys did very, very well.
Yeah, I'll echo Tim's comments there. Using popular culture, even if it's a couple decades old, is very important, because it shows that these ideas still live. I really liked your referencing the Declaration. I think that's something that we forget. But I also wanted to hear at the end, and I was glad I did, that the Constitution itself wasn't more revolutionary, but it embodies, right? It carries into practice the revolutionary spirit of that Declaration. So it's with us, but it's tempered. And as you go forward, and you're obviously really intelligent young people and have a great futures, but keep thinking about the challenges that we face to these ideas of consent, right? Right now in our history, we're facing really some real big challenges to that idea, right? And think about, what are the remedies, both individually or systematically or constitutionally, like the 14th Amendment and Supremacy Clause. Some of our states are doing some interesting things, trying to sort of protect elections by denying people the right to vote, or at least making it harder. So keep thinking, keep evaluating, keep judging. I think you're all doing great, and I wish you luck tomorrow as well.
Yes, accommodations to each of you, and a big thanks for all the work you've put in, and to your teacher as well. That's impressive. As my colleague said, you each complimented one another. You had impressive citations and references to supporting information to the points you were making. As Mr. Fox just mentioned, there are some interesting, it's a huge challenge. The internet question, and whether democracy is easier or hindered with that is probably not an easily answerable question, but one to kind of spend some time pondering around the consent. And when there are instances where less than half the people vote, it kind of calls that into question. And you made the point, one of you, as far as along those lines. So anyway, nicely done. It was enjoyable to listen to you. You're impressive, and we wish you well going forward. Not just through this competition, but down the road.